In this lesson series, we'll be looking at the ungodly origins and outcomes of Darwinism. For this video, part 1, we'll be going over Darwin himself. Now, before getting into anything, first, a disclaimer about this lesson series. To be clear, in no way, shape, or form am I saying that all macroevolutionists are social Darwinists that believe in everything Darwin and/or any social Darwinist believed. What I am saying, though, is that because of the beliefs of Darwin and the intrinsic necessity of biological Darwinism within social Darwinism, macroevolution has a reason to be rejected. And that biological Darwinism is not only compatible with the evil and pseudoscientific beliefs of Darwin and social Darwinists, but that they cannot be separated from each other, in that the latter cannot be separated from the former. All social Darwinists are macroevolutionists, but not all macroevolutionists are Darwinists. I know and acknowledge this. Because this is like how all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. This is the point of this lesson series. So what we'll look at for this part is Darwin's religion and his connection to the following: social Darwinism and eugenics, the development of scientific racism, and then white/Anglo supremacy. They'll move from looking at his connections to those things to looking at the full title of Origin of Species, then phrenology, aka craniology, then how Darwin dehumanized people in his book called Descent of Man. We'll look at some things in the book overall, and then look at some direct quotes from it. Then look at Darwin's bleak and depressing worldview, then how his anti-slavery stance is irrelevant to making up for all these evil things associated with him, and then finally contrast his worldview with that of Jesus. And just as a note, the Descent of Man pages, all of them are typed right, but some of them I accidentally said the wrong page, and they're signified by an asterisk. Now, when it comes to Darwin's religion, there's much debate about it, but here's what we do know. Darwin grew up in a Unitarian family, but became an agnostic who disagreed with both atheists and worshipping theists like Christians. In this quote from Darwin, he says, "The mystery of the beginning of all things is insolvable by us," though I'd like to point out he says this while he proposes his own genesis, his own origin of kinds and species. And quote continues, "And I, for one, must be content to remain an agnostic." So he was a self-proclaimed agnostic, just like his followers, like the members of the X Club, which was basically the Darwin fan club. And it included the man who coined the term agnostic, Thomas H. Huxley, aka Darwin's bulldog. Probably heard of that. And you see, when it came to Darwin's belief about the existence of a deity, he believed a God created the universe itself, along with its natural processes, and then basically just threw up his hands and said, all right, what happens, happens. He had a belief in a very cold, heartless God. Now, when it comes to Darwin's connection to social Darwinism and eugenics, X-Club member Herbert Spencer invented social Darwinism and coined survival of the fittest, which was then taken by Darwin and used in his theory about biology. So survival of the fittest was not coined by Darwin, it was coined by the man who invented social Darwinism, Herbert Spencer, Darwin's fanboy, one of them. And then Darwin took that phrase and used it in his own theory. So he hijacked the phrase, kind of. Also, Darwin had a close buddy-buddy relationship with his cousin Francis Galton, who is the father of eugenics. So, I mean, when it comes to social Darwinism and eugenics, Darwin was close to these people and definitely could have spoken up and said, hey, you know, that stuff doesn't actually coincide with my theory. But you see, macroevolution is to eugenics as God is to theism. You can't have the latter without the former. So to say that social Darwinism and eugenics are total misuses of Darwin's beliefs about biology and the rest of his worldview, or that their claim that macroevolution is about making a higher or better organism and not just greater biodiversity, is absolutely false. It's his popularization of macroevolution that led to the subsequent popularization of eugenics. When it comes to Darwin's connection to the development of scientific racism, according to Darwinian evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould in Ontology and Phylogeny, written in 1977, he says, quote, biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859, which, if you don't know, is when On the Origin of Species was published. So continues, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. You see, scientific racism can't exist without a proposition for scientific evidence of biological race. Duh. Well, what did Darwin propose? Scientific grounds for the existence of biological race. And so he knew what he was doing, especially since biological arguments for racism may have and really probably were common before the publishing of Origin of Species. When it comes to his connection to white/Anglo supremacy, is it honestly that ridiculous to think that there is a connection between white/Anglo supremacy, Darwin's belief that Caucasians are the highest race, and his own English ethnicity and Caucasian identity that people try to claim? Or is it really just that likely that all these interconnected things are interconnected? And you see, just about every atrocity or just general discrimination committed based on belief that biological racial divisions within humanity exist with scientific evidence for it ultimately returns back to Darwin because he's the one who popularized this belief. Now let's move on and look at the full title of Origin of Species, which is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Because apparently Darwin couldn't write a short book title to save his life. Now, to be fair to Darwin, because it would be unjust to be unfair to him, when he says favored races, he's not referring to it in a social sense like a social Darwinist would. What he refers to is species originating from natural selection by fit, meaning adapted or superior at surviving races, surviving through winning out resource competition, like resources like food and water, and this resulting in inherently involving the extinction of the unfit races, those who are unadapted or inferior survivors. So it doesn't have a direct social connotation, but it easily could. Now, phrenology, aka craniology, says that skull/head measurements can tell about one's mental abilities and that it can be used to compare mental faculties between different races and sexes, meaning you can tell what kind of mental abilities and how much of them a person has based on measuring their skull or head. And you can also take those measurements and then compare them between the races and sexes. Now, this is considered absolute crackpot racist and sexist pseudoscience by essentially everybody today. And Darwin believed in this himself. From Descent of Man on page 61 about the so-called races, he says, quote, the belief that there exists in man some close relation between the size of the brain and the development of the intellectual faculties is supported by the comparison of the skulls of savage and civilized races of ancient and modern people, and by the analogy of the whole vertebrate series. Now let's look at how Darwin has dehumanized people in his writings, first looking at his book, Descent of Man, and so in general. In it, you will find 215 uses of the word savage to either refer to animals like particularly, dogs, and what he calls lower races. We also find observations and descriptions of these savages of lower races that mimic those that you would find a field observer writing about an animal. So in other words, he's writing about these people in the same way you would write about an animal. Also, he even compares their behaviors to those of a dog. And finally, the words savage and civilized are about always coupled with biological race as an adjective, implying that these are not merely social descriptions that you might use, but are biological ones referring to the race as either being more or less evolved away from apes, which is how they are often described anyways. So now let's look at a quote from this book. On page 201, you'll find, quote, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of, as at the present, between the Negro or Australian, meaning an aboriginal, and the gorilla." So really, in other words, what he's saying is that it might as well be a guaranteed fact that in less than 200 or 300 years, human races that are more evolved away from apes will genocide to total extinction the less evolved ones, resulting in his and others' desired higher evolved race and lessening the number of extant intermediate kinds, of which there are that not that many between gorillas and high melanin people because they're not that different from each other. What the heck? And let's look at another quote from this book. Page 62, you'll find the quote, "On the other hand, as if I'm pronouncing this right, Buchner has remarked, how little can the hard-worked wife of a degraded Australian, again that means an aboriginal, savage who uses hardly any abstract words and cannot count above 4, exert her self-consciousness or reflect on the nature of her own existence." So in other words, he's saying an overworked aboriginal housewife can barely comprehend and express her own self-awareness, which would then imply that she is low sentience, because I'm pretty sure there aren't any overworked housewives that can barely think about simple philosophical questions and concepts like the self and one's own existence that a 4 to 6-year-old can easily consider. Please, if there are any housewives that see this video, let me know in the comments who's right or at least close to right, me or Darwin. And it's like, how did Darwin even come to his latter two conclusions? Like, what exactly did he observe to find that out? And if those quotes are enough, how about a couple more? Page 126. Quote, "Nevertheless, the difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not of kind." So in other words, ontologically, man and beast are the same. Like pertaining to our minds, we have the same minds. Ours is just a higher degree. Well, for man and beast to ontologically be the same, according to this quote, that removes and rejects man's unique essence as being made in God's image, and it would mean Jesus' human nature, like all human nature, would equate to that of a chimp. Again, he's saying ontologically, we're the same kind. And then this would remove the drastic necessity of Christ taking on humanity, because scripturally, Christ had to take on humanity because the nature of any other organism didn't count. It had to be of the human kind. But again, according to this quote from Darwin, man and beast, ontologically, mentally, same thing, just one higher ability than the other. And then page 134, quote, we build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. So, in other words, what he's saying is it hurts our progress to let the mentally ill, physically disabled / injured, and diseased procreate, have offspring. Because, we're just like animals. So if we don't let the inferior versions of them breed, why should we let the inferior versions of us breed? That is sick. Now, let's move into concluding on Darwin's bleak and depressing worldview, which we've been looking in pieces of in previous subjects. In this quote from Darwin, he says, in however complex a manner this feeling may have originated, as it is one of high importance to all those animals which aid and defend one another, it will have been increased through natural selection. For those communities which include the greatest number of the most sympathetic members would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring. So in other words, according to his worldview, sympathy is just a product of natural selection so that your species or race or kind, whatever, has a greater chance of survival. That's it. That's all. That's why it exists. And here's another quote. From the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of higher animals, directly follows. So in other words, according to his worldview, the best thing that can possibly come out of death and suffering is just a higher creature. Not justice, not mercy, not, anything that Christians say are the reason God allows evil. To him, the greatest thing that can come from these things is a more evolved organism. You see, to Darwin, death, evil, and morality are just parts of the way the natural world just goes, with no philosophical or religious meaning. They're just things that exist. Now, whenever somebody tries to talk about the evil Darwin believed and wrote about and how horrible of a person he was, many people will often try to counter that and defend him and say, well, wait a minute, but he was anti-slavery. That's a great thing. Yeah, but his stance on slavery, his opposing stance to slavery, is irrelevant to all his horridness. See, because does what all the other things he said and believed that we went over, is that undone by his opposition to slavery? No, of course not. And though he called slavery evil, he viewed it as a naturally produced phenomena like morality was. Damn, it's just this thing that exists in the natural world. Also, he dehumanized people, as we went over, comparing them with animals and acting like there's very little difference between us and them. So he has no justification for his abolitionist beliefs. He had abolitionist beliefs, but he had no grounds for it. He was just very inconsistent. You see, his personal beliefs about the value of human beings and other living creatures is totally antithetical to his beliefs about biology, natural process, and God's existence that we've gone over. We need to stop giving people passes for their sins just because they've made major contributions to history that are viewed positively. If someone wants to think that Darwin was a great biologist and contributed greatly to biology, fine. I think you're wrong, but fine. But do not then use that as an excuse to try and cover up all his evil, to ignore all his evil. You have to acknowledge that too. Now, end this part of the lesson series contrasting Darwin's worldview with that of Jesus. In Darwin's worldview, man originated from fish coitus. Man's basically the same as animals, but the most evolved to the highest degree so far. Man's composed of multiple differently evolved races. Slavery is wrong, but for no justifiable reason, because it's a naturally produced phenomena. Death's natural and leads to fitter races. That's the best thing it can lead to. Christian miracles can be found literally unbelievable. And God doesn't care for anyone's pain. But in Jesus' worldview, man originated from God's will. Man's made in God's image uniquely. Man is of one race with inner variety of phenotypes. That's physical appearing traits. Slavery violates God's will and creation. Death is an enemy that's created by sin. Christianity is founded by Jesus, and miracles do exist. He did many of them himself. And God cares so much that he, Jesus himself, God himself, sacrificed himself that we may be free from sin forever. Now, which of these ones fit these Bible chapters I have shown, and is probably the worldview we should have too, especially us Christians?